Iran. An angry mob demands the pro-communist prime minister resign in favor of the pro-Western Shah. Guatemala. A ragtag army crosses the border to overthrow a president who seizes American assets. Cuba. An invasion force lands at the Bay of Pigs to oust communist dictator Fidel Castro. Espionage, propaganda, subversion, diplomacy, CIA style. July 19th, 1953. A rented car drives James Lockridge, American businessman, from Beirut, Lebanon to Tehran, Iran. He crosses the border at Canankin, where a guard improperly lists his name as Mr. Scar on right forehead. It doesn't make any difference. James Lockridge isn't his real name, and he's not really an American businessman. He's an agent for the CIA. America's Central Intelligence Agency. His mission? Orchestrate the CIA's first attempt to overthrow a government. Real name, Kermit Roosevelt. Age, 35. Born Buenos Aires, Argentina. Grandson of the 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. He graduates from Harvard in 1938. And becomes an historian, a businessman, and an intelligence officer with the OSS. The Middle East is full of political intrigue. Iran, formerly known as Persia, is the fabled setting for Scheherazade, Alibaba, and Aladdin. But Kermit Roosevelt has to deal with reality. His target, Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran. The issues are communism and oil. Mossadegh is a colorful eccentric who holds news conferences in bed, wearing pajamas. The flamboyant prime minister has reduced the young Shah, Reza Pahlavi, to the status of puppet ruler. The Shah is the heir to the royal throne of Iran. Mossadegh, sympathetic to the Soviet Union, is a social reformer who detests Western imperialism. Even worse, he nationalizes the profitable Anglo-Iranian oil company. The British are livid and withdraw their technicians in protest. In Washington, President Dwight D. Eisenhower agrees to help the British overthrow Mossadegh. Operation Ajax is born. The new director of the Central Intelligence Agency is in charge. Name, Alan Welsh Dulles, age 63. A patrician and conservative educated at Princeton. His brother, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State for President Eisenhower. Alan Dulles ran OSS operations in Switzerland during World War II. He is a covert operations expert. The CIA's first order of business is to contact the Shah and tell him the United States and Great Britain are ready to support him in his attempt to regain power. But making contact is difficult. The palace is bugged. The American agent, Kermit Roosevelt, and the Shah must meet in secret. At these clandestine meetings, they agree on a plan. Roosevelt promises Western backing. The Shah issues 2 royal decrees called firmans, one deposing Mossadegh, the other appointing the Shah's brother-in-law, General Fazlollah Zahedi, as prime minister. When the decrees are served, Mossadegh, tipped off by a double agent, ignores them. He gathers troops loyal to him and goes on the air to announce that there's a plot against him and that he is seizing absolute power. The Shah and his wife flee to Rome in exile. The U.S. State Department sends a message ordering Kermit Roosevelt to give up and get out. But a loyal friend of Roosevelt in communications delays the message, giving him another 24 hours to try again. Roosevelt believes that the people and the army will rise up against Mossadegh with the help of the CIA. Somewhere in the milling throngs hide two professional agitators, codenamed Bosco I and Bosco II. They incite peasants trucked in from the countryside, paid by the CIA. Following Roosevelt's script, the mob surges through the streets of Tehran shouting, "Down with Mossadegh, long live the Shah." Then, at just the right moment, Roosevelt sends General Zahedi riding on top of a tank to lead the mob. They ransack Mossadegh's house, but the Prime Minister escapes. 3 days later, Mossadegh surrenders to Iranian police. He is tried for treason and placed under house arrest for 3 years. August 29, 1953, the Shah triumphantly returns. To Roosevelt, he says, "I owe my throne to God, my people, my army, and to you." The grateful Shah agrees to the creation of the National Iranian Oil Company, 40% American, 40% British, as long as the Shah remains in power. Under Kermit Roosevelt's skillful direction, Operation Ajax takes 1 month and costs only $60,000. The Iran coup is the pinnacle of CIA Chief Allen Dulles' career. But despite the success of Operation Ajax, the agent who pulled it off, Kermit Roosevelt, issues a warning.
I said, don't make the mistake of believing that this can be done anytime you want to do it. The situation has to be exactly right. You've got to have the people on your side and hopefully the army too.
But his warning falls on deaf ears. Allen Dulles is already thinking about the next communist threat, Guatemala. Early spring, 1954, Guatemala. Undercover as an international businessman, a CIA agent blends into the crowds in Guatemala City. Name, E. Howard Hunt. Age, 35. Born in Hamburg, New York in 1918. A Brown University graduate. OSS officer behind the lines in China during World War II. Covert action specialist. Speaks fluent Spanish. CIA Director Allen Dulles has sent him to Central America to find out just how loyal ranking officers are to the Guatemalan president. Hunt reports many officers are disloyal. Important information for CIA planning. Guatemala, a genuine banana republic, is dominated by a giant American company. United Fruit not only controls the fruit industry, but also the railroads, the telephone system, even the delivery of mail. Most Guatemalans live in poverty. 75% are illiterate. Life expectancy is 40 years. The peasants believe they are being exploited by United Fruit. Newly elected President Jacobo Arbenz promises agrarian reform and to break United Fruit's monopoly. The CIA believes he is sympathetic to communism and pro-Soviet. Eager to modernize his country, President Arbenz confiscates 400,000 acres of undeveloped United Fruit land. He plans to redistribute it to the peasants. United Fruit appeals to Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, at one time the company's legal counsel. He agrees to help and rid Guatemala of a president he considers communist. His brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles, a United Fruit stockholder and once a member of its board of directors, is given the go-ahead. The CIA gives its plan the code name Operation Success. The coup attempt will depend on a handful of soldiers, a small air force, and the massive use of psychological warfare. the CIA assembles an experienced team. Under Richard Bissell, special assistant to Allen Dulles, the CIA assigns veteran agent E. Howard Hunt as chief of political action. Objective: overthrow the president and replace him with Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. Armas is a career Army officer who led an earlier coup attempt that failed. Virtually unknown outside Guatemala, he is an anti-communist who can be counted on to protect the interests of United Fruit. The CIA sets up a clandestine training camp in neighboring Honduras. Armas recruits several hundred Guatemalan exiles and a few soldiers of fortune for his so-called Army of Liberation. The CIA scrapes up 4 overage World War II bombers for Operation Success. Volunteer American pilots will fly them. The key to success will be psychological warfare, to make Arbenz believe a massive revolution is underway. From secret radio stations, the CIA's propaganda team orchestrates a campaign of psychological pressure designed to confuse Arbenz. The CIA broadcasts reports of revolutionary armies poised at the border, ready to invade. Arbenz begins to panic. He takes the bait and believes the ragtag army is a powerful invasion force, backed by the United States. Arbenz turns to the Soviet Union for weapons. In May, a Swedish freighter, the Alfhem, arrives in Guatemala carrying small arms and ammunition from Czechoslovakia. Washington now has an excuse to overthrow Arbenz. June 18, 1954, Colonel Armas' tiny CIA Army of Liberation crosses the border in a few battered trucks. Inside Guatemala, there are no cheering throngs. The army stops after proceeding a mere 6 miles. They wait to see what happens. The 4 American bombers flying back and forth out of the airport in Managua, Nicaragua, have a devastating effect. The pilots, carrying anything that can make a loud noise, including blocks of dynamite strapped to hand grenades and pop bottles filled with gasoline, drop their explosives and strafe highly visible targets. Parade grounds, ammunition dumps, army barracks. Although there are few casualties, the air raids break the morale of the army and general public. The CIA propaganda broadcasts report fictitious victories by a phantom army of 5,000. In truth, the Army of Liberation has fewer than 400 men and never sees combat. But Arbenz believes what he hears. Totally unnerved by the CIA's phony radio reports, he resigns and takes sanctuary in the Mexican embassy. Colonel Armas now makes his move. 50,000 people tossing firecrackers supplied beforehand by the CIA cheer as he enters the capital. July 7th, 1954. Carlos Castillo Armas is elected president of Guatemala. He was the only candidate. The United Fruit Company quickly reclaims its land that Arbenz had seized. Armas arrests some 4,000 people suspected of being communists. He also repeals the 1945 Constitution and revokes all civil rights of the population. He soon becomes a dictator. In the fall of 1954, President Armas is given a ticker-tape parade in New York City and awarded honorary degrees by Fordham and Columbia universities. Allen Dulles' second coup d'etat takes less than 3 weeks and costs close to $20 million. Guatemala will be his model for CIA subversion on an even grander scale. Next target, Fidel Castro and Cuba. Allen Dulles pinpoints Cuba for his most ambitious attempt to eliminate a foreign leader, Fidel Castro. Again, the issue is communism, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Havana, New Year's Day, 1959. A triumphant Castro seizes power from the corrupt dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro nationalizes American property in Cuba and offers to pay for it with nearly worthless Cuban bonds. The U.S. rejects his offer. Castro refuses to negotiate. Castro turns to the Soviet Union for military and economic assistance. 1 year after taking power, he signs a formal trade agreement with the Soviet Union. Castro and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev seal their friendship at the United Nations. Cuba is now firmly in the Soviet camp. By midsummer, Soviet weapons start arriving in Cuba. Alarmed, President Eisenhower once again turns to the Dulles brothers. CIA Director Allen Dulles promptly dusts off the Guatemala model. The CIA recruits Cuban exiles in Miami, sends them off to training camps in Guatemala, and turns to the same team that made the Guatemalan coup work so well. Richard Bissell, now Deputy Director of the CIA, is in overall control of the Cuba operation. As one CIA officer says, where there's action, you can find Bissell. And again, E. Howard Hunt, the CIA's unorthodox senior field agent. His job, organize a provisional government. In Guatemala, the CIA trains a Cuban exile force of 1,500 men. This tiny army, the 2506 Brigade, is expected to invade Cuba, hold the beachhead for 72 hours, and wait for a popular uprising against Castro. Success will depend on American air support. January 1961, a new American president takes office. John F. Kennedy inherits the CIA's plan to overthrow Castro from former President Eisenhower. The new president reluctantly gives Allen Dulles and the CIA free rein, but complications soon arise. Kennedy begins to have doubts about the CIA's invasion plan. He worries that U.S. air support will reveal America's clandestine role. The president sets up a war room in the White House and takes personal control. Secretary of State Dean Rusk convinces Kennedy to change the landing site to avoid civilian casualties. The coastal town of Trinidad, population 18,000, is replaced by the remote Bay of Pigs, isolated, swampy, and unpopulated. April 15th, 1961. The first airstrike destroys most of Castro's air force, except for 3 armed jet trainers. These planes will play a decisive role in turning back the invasion. Fearing public exposure of American involvement, President Kennedy cancels a second airstrike. It is a fatal decision. April 17th. The invasion force reaches its destination, the Bay of Pigs. Improperly charted shoals and reefs play havoc with the ships. Once ashore, the invaders bog down in marshy terrain that makes movement difficult. The Cuban people do not rise up against Castro as expected. The Cuban army does not defect. Outnumbered and outgunned, Brigade 2506 is doomed. The Cuban jets that survived the first airstrike shoot down 6 B-26 bombers supporting the invasion and sink the brigade's vital supply ships. Castro brings up his heavy tanks and artillery. The brigade is decimated. On Wednesday, April 19th, the CIA-backed invaders surrender. 114 have been killed. Of the original 1,500, all but 300 are taken prisoner. The Bay of Pigs is a resounding victory for Fidel Castro and a humbling defeat for President Kennedy, who made the key and fatal decision to withhold air support. The CIA bears the brunt of the disgrace. Allen Dulles is made the scapegoat. His bold and brilliant deputy, Richard Bissell, also falls from grace. He is demoted, then resigns. 5 months later, Dulles retires from the CIA. But Allen Dulles's fate might have been different if he had heeded Kermit Roosevelt's warning after the successful coup in Iran.
I said, don't make the mistake of believing that this can be done anytime you want to do it. The situation has to be exactly right. You've got to have the people on your side and hopefully the army too.
Kermit Roosevelt's warning and the lesson of the Bay of Pigs will haunt the CIA for years to come. And now, Spies presents Target Cuba, the story of the CIA's finest hour during the Cuban Missile Crisis. October 1962. America deploys 18 intercontinental ballistic missiles and prepares to fire them. The United States and the Soviet Union are at the brink of war over Russian missiles in the Caribbean island nation of Cuba. Only sophisticated spying could have revealed these weapons targeted on American cities. It's the moment of truth in the Cold War, and the decisive weapon is aerial espionage. August 29, 1962. A U-2 reconnaissance aircraft operated by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency is ordered into the skies over Cuba. Its mission, photograph the entire island. Reports of Russian missiles on the Caribbean island have put the United States and the Soviet Union on a collision course. The U-2's camera, scanning the ground from a height of more than 13 miles, takes clear pictures of Soviet missile crews at work. The pictures trigger a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union that thrusts the two countries to the brink of nuclear war. Throughout the summer of 1962, Cuban refugees arriving on the coast of Florida describe a steady flow of Soviet weapons onto the island. The U-2 reconnaissance mission is prompted by reports from CIA agents in Cuba that Soviet SAM-2s, deadly air defense missiles, are moving on Cuban roads. CIA analysts studying aerial photographs of Soviet merchant ships identify many of the weapons bound for Cuba. By measuring the crates lashed to the decks, photo interpreters can determine the military cargoes they conceal. They know, for example, that these crates contain Soviet missile-firing patrol boats, lethal weapons that can sink an aircraft carrier. Later, the boats, called Komars, are photographed in the Cuban harbor at Mariel. The identification technique is called cratology. It's the brainchild of the intelligence officer who directs the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center. Name, Arthur Lundahl, born April 1st, 1915, Chicago, Illinois. Education, University of Chicago. Occupation, leading authority on photographic intelligence.
The U-2 had been flying in many other places, and we saw crates coming off of ships. We saw the boxes being opened up, and we'd see what had come out of the box. So maybe some months later, you'd see the exact same crate coming off a ship down in Cuba. You had no doubt about calling it a MiG-21 that arrived today, or an IL-28, a Beagle, or whatever it was that was coming in. So we had a big handle on a great deal of Soviet military hardware from years of work up to the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
When they examined the U-2 photographs of August 29th, Lundahl and his staff of photo interpreters pinpoint 8 SAMs, surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles, in place and ready to launch on the northwest coast of Cuba. The SAMs can reach 70,000 feet, high enough to shoot down a U-2. There is no doubt. The missile site is clearly visible. The 6 launchers linked by roadways forming an unmistakable 6-pointed star. Dino Brugioni, senior officer at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, knows what to look for.
The photo interpreter works from what is known as a signature. The military do things in a pattern. And once you establish one of those sites, you have a photograph and a pattern for identifying that same site all over the world. We had seen the SA-2 sites in Russia, and not only Russia, but then in Egypt, Indonesia, and so that when they appeared in Cuba, it was no great surprise.
U.S. intelligence officials know it was a SAM-2 that shot U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers out of the sky over the Soviet Union 2 years earlier in 1960. Top advisors to President Kennedy are not especially alarmed over the Russian missiles. Secretary of State Dean Rusk and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy point out that the SAMs are purely defensive to bolster Cuba against a feared U.S. invasion. CIA Director John McCone is almost alone in his belief that the Soviets intend to make Cuba a base for offensive nuclear missiles aimed at the United States. McCone puts it this way: they are not putting the SAMs in to protect the cane cutters. They're putting them in to blind our reconnaissance eye. Rusk and Bundy worry more about a diplomatic crisis should a U-2 get shot down by Soviet missiles. In September, they order spy flights over the island discontinued. President Kennedy backs them up, agreeing that the SAMs are clearly defensive weapons. But Kennedy warns the Soviets not to go any further. He issues a statement observing that there is no evidence of offensive missiles in Cuba. Were it to be otherwise, he warns, the gravest issues would arise. But the warning comes too late. September 15th, U.S. reconnaissance aircraft photographed the Soviet merchant ship Poltava in the western Atlantic, headed for Cuba, with a deadly cargo of nuclear missiles. For 6 weeks following the discovery of the SAM sites, there is no aerial reconnaissance over Cuba. But CIA agents on the island continue to report missile sightings, especially near the town of San Cristobal in western Cuba. Finally, nearly a month after the Soviet ship Poltava has delivered her cargo of nuclear missiles, President Kennedy approves a U-2 flight over the western tip of the island. The U-2 flies on Sunday, October 14, 1962. Its pictures stun the intelligence analysts. The photos clearly show that the Soviets are building 3 separate launch sites for offensive medium-range ballistic missiles. The analysts who make the discovery summon their boss, Arthur Lundahl.
Now, photo interpreters are a very, very cagey bunch of cats. They won't tell you what you're looking at. They'll wait to see what you say you've seen, and then that becomes confirmation. But if they tell you what you're looking at, that's nothing. They put that idea in your head. So I looked up at them and I said, well, I think I know what you guys are thinking, and I'm thinking the same thing. But let's go over the bidding together. And we all agreed that it was the SS-4 we're looking at.
The objects in the photographs had been seen often in Moscow parades. SS-4 missiles resting on their transporters. 6 in this frame, 7 in another. Using a technique called photogrammetry, determining the size of an object from the size of its photographic image, Lundahl and his colleagues established the length of the transporters as 67 feet, precisely the length of the trailers used to transport the SS-4. Tuesday, October 16th. By the time President Kennedy enters the cabinet room, a few minutes before noon, he has already heard the grim news. But it is Arthur Lundahl's job to convince the president that the CIA's photo interpreters are right.
He was very calm and very cool. He showed no tremulousness. His voice was firm. He asked good questions. We got to the end. He thought for a minute, and then he turned quietly in his chair and looked me straight in the eye, and he said, "Are you sure of all this?" And I said, "Mr. President, I am as sure of this as a photo interpreter can be sure of anything. And I think you might agree we haven't misled you on the many other subjects that we have reported to you. Yes, I'm quite convinced that they are missiles."
Thursday, October 18th. President Kennedy receives the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gramico. The Soviets do not know how much Kennedy knows. For Gramico, the visit is an exercise in the art of maskirovka, the Soviet doctrine of concealment and disinformation. He has a message from the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, assuring Kennedy that the military buildup in Cuba is purely defensive. Kennedy has Arthur Lundahl's U-2 photographs with him in the Oval Office, but chooses not to reveal them to Gramico. As the Russian leaves, Kennedy whispers to his aides, "That lying bastard." Later that day, Arthur Lundahl and his team of CIA photo interpreters report alarming new evidence of the Soviet missile buildup in Cuba. They have seen this signature before in U-2 photography over the Soviet Union. They are launch pads for even more threatening SS-5s, intermediate-range ballistic missiles that can reach targets 2,200 miles away. All of the continental U.S., except the extreme northwest, is in danger now.
It was the pattern. It had a series of slash marks, and as soon as you saw that, you were quite convinced you were looking at 3 or 4 of them in an offset pattern, and that cement was being poured, heavy stuff was being installed.
Espionage is now the Americans' chief weapon in the crisis. Espionage in the form of aerial photography, a kind of spying never employed on such a scale before. The president and his advisors consider 3 possible plans of action: an invasion of Cuba, an airstrike at the missile bases, or a blockade of Soviet ships carrying weapons. Monday, October 22nd. The CIA reports 4 Soviet missile sites in Cuba are ready to fire nuclear warheads at the U.S. The Joint Chiefs of Staff press for an immediate invasion of the island. The president's advisors urge a massive air attack on the missile sites. But Kennedy holds back. He fears that a military strike at Cuba will trigger a Soviet counterattack on Berlin. On nationwide television, he tells the American people about the missiles in Cuba and orders an immediate blockade of Soviet shipping.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
The Navy moves to blockade stations in the Western Atlantic. The biggest mobilization since World War II is underway. 4 Army divisions, including the 82nd and 101st Airborne, go on alert. Nuclear bombs are loaded on B-52s. They fly to a holding zone over the Arctic Circle, where they will be ordered to return to base or go on to their targets in the Soviet Union. ICBMs are prepared for launch at 18 sites around the U.S. Missile-firing Polaris submarines go on station in the North Atlantic with nuclear warheads capable of destroying the Soviet Union's principal cities. The U.S. and the Soviet Union are at the brink of war. October 24th. The news comes through in the early hours of the morning. 5 Soviet cargo ships, believed to be carrying missiles, have turned around before reaching the blockade line and are heading home. The quarantine is working. But Soviet missiles remain on their launch pads in Cuba, poised to strike at American cities. The crisis is not over. Thursday, October 25th. Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, engages in an emotional debate in the Security Council. He accuses the Soviets of deploying offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba. His adversary, Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin, claims the U.S. is lying about the missiles. Stevenson challenges Zorin.
Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no.
I should like to say, Mr. Stevenson, would you continue your statement, please? You will receive the answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
But Stevenson does not wait. He has Arthur Lundahl's aerial photographs with him, and he tells the stunned delegates what they mean. The U-2 photographs are rock-solid proof of Soviet lying and bad faith. But the attempt to find a diplomatic solution at the United Nations drowns in bitter rhetoric. The news from Cuba is bad. A U-2 reconnaissance plane flying a mission over the island is shot down by a Soviet SAM-2. The pilot, Air Force Major Rudolf Anderson, is killed. But other U-2 missions provide a steady stream of photographs that reveal the Soviets rushing their missile sites to completion. This photograph shows 5 SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles. A 6th missile is inside the tent. CIA photo interpreters report all 24 launch pads in Cuba are now capable of firing missiles at the United States.
This was a rainy season in Cuba, and the ground was wet. Keep in mind, now these missiles are out in pasture lands. And so we report that we see tracks from the missile-ready buildings to the launchers, indicating that the Soviets have rehearsed the firing of the missiles.
As the crisis surges forward, espionage, in the form of aerial photography, forces new policy decisions. The Joint Chiefs of Staff pressure President Kennedy to launch an air attack on the missile site and then invade Cuba. He will have to make the decision within hours. Before he does, he orders Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, to deliver a final ultimatum to the Soviets. Unless the missiles are withdrawn, strong and overwhelming retaliation is coming. President Kennedy can act with confidence because he knows the U.S. is stronger than the Soviet Union, especially when it comes to missiles and bombers. His information comes from 2 main sources. One is U-2 aerial reconnaissance over the Soviet Union. The other source is the double agent Oleg Penkovsky, a colonel in Soviet military intelligence, who has turned over thousands of secret documents to the West. The Americans learn they have overestimated Russian missile strength. In fact, the U.S. has the Soviets outgunned. Kennedy believes that Khrushchev will back down. Kennedy is right. In return for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, the Soviets capitulate. October 28th, Khrushchev's reply is broadcast on Radio Moscow. The Soviets issue orders to dismantle the missiles and return them to the Soviet Union. The president and the nation share a collective sigh of relief. Kennedy had ordered airstrikes on Cuba within 48 hours if the missiles were not removed. But Kennedy has been lied to by the top officials of the Soviet government. He wants ironclad proof that the missiles are coming out of Cuba. Aerial photography verifies the Soviet retreat and the American victory.
We monitored each missile site, the equipment, counted it, and then watched it go to the port, counted it again, and then once it was put aboard ship, counted it still a third time.
Knowing the Americans distrust them, the Russians open many of the crates as they lay on the deck, allowing their contents to be photographed. These are IL-28 bombers, capable of carrying nuclear bombs, on their way back to the Soviet Union. Friday, November 2nd. President Kennedy goes on television with a message of victory for the American people. He emphasizes the importance of aerial photography in resolving the crisis.
I want to take this opportunity to report on the conclusions which this government has reached on the basis of yesterday's aerial photographs, which will be made available tomorrow, as well as other indications, namely that the Soviet missile bases in Cuba are being dismantled, their missiles and related equipment are being crated, and the fixed installations at these sites are being destroyed.
In a letter to Arthur Lundahl, Kennedy acknowledges the role of the photo interpreters. Kennedy writes, "While I would like to make public the truly outstanding accomplishments of the National Photographic Interpretation Center, I realize that the anonymity of an organization of your high professional competence in the intelligence field must be maintained." Arthur Lundahl dies on June 22, 1992. He was 77 years old, a pioneer in the art of aerial espionage and photo analysis. During the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, his coolness under fire and calm, clear brilliance helped an American president avert nuclear war. Arthur Lundahl rose to the occasion and gave American intelligence its finest hour.